What I think we all realize then, being voters in primary states, you realize its importance even though you don't live here, is that the voters in Nevada and Iowa and New Hampshire and South Carolina will be making a decision when you go to caucus on February 22nd, which is possibly consequential for the entire world. I do not feel, when I'm in any of these states, that people don't realize the profundity of the power that lies in your hands. I'm also a fan of the system. Some people have suggested that we should have one day, one primary day, all of the states. I actually don't. I think there's something really profound about the fact that states like Nevada, Iowa, South Carolina, and New Hampshire would be carrying this kind of responsibility. Partly because, as I said, the feeling I get in these states is that you do realize how important it is. You have many candidates to choose from this year, more than you would think listening to the DNC and who they allow on the debate stage. And it is your responsibility to do your due diligence and to listen to us. I think all of us have different ideas, a lot of really good ideas. I don't feel like I'm running against anyone. I feel like I'm running with a lot of really good people. But we have some differing views on two important things. One, how the Democrats might win in 2020, and number two, what direction this country should be going in. So I welcome this opportunity. I'm grateful to you. Thank you for allowing me to give you my vision, my views, my opinion about where I feel America is, how I feel we got here, and what I think we need to do to get ourselves into a very different place. First of all, I believe that whether you're an individual or a nation, you are greatly empowered when you recognize the context, the historical context of your existence today. Just like when you go to therapy, you learn about your parents, your grandparents, where your family came from. It clues you into your own identity. And when you have that, you have a greater sense of what you feel you owe your ancestors, and also a greater sense of what you owe your descendants. That is as true of a country as it is of an individual. And for those of you who are young, there's particular profundity here, because those of you who are college age, for instance, you're not 20th century people. You will live the majority of your lives in the 21st century, or you might possibly have even been born in the 20th century. So there's no reason for you to live your life burdened by the effects of bad ideas left over from the 20th century. So there's a lot, particularly for young people, to figure out. Just like when you go to therapy and you learn about your parents and you realize, what did my parents do right? And you get, wow, I want to stand on their shoulders on that one and do it even better if I can and pass that along to my kids. But other things you look at that your parents might have done and you go, that was neurotic, that was wrong, and that one's going to stop right here. That chain's going to break right here. I will not be giving that one to my children. Well, we can do that. Civilizations do that too. Societies do that. So it's important for us to know what was good about the 20th century, what do we want to carry forward, and what was just a bad idea from the 20th century, what do we not want to take with us into the 21st? But in knowing who we are as Americans, this stuff goes all the way back to 1776. What has America done right? What do we want to claim? What do we want to embody? And what has America done wrong that we need to atone for, make amends for, and stop right now? That's the responsibility of citizenship. Citizenship in the United States gives us rights for which we should be grateful, and I think that too many of us take for granted. But it also gives us great responsibilities, once again, particularly great at a time like this for citizens in states like Nevada. In 1776, some very brave men signed the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is our mission statement. And I say they were brave because if the British had won the war for independence, then those men would have been executed as traitors against the King of England. They laid down principles that are the most enlightened and aspirational principles that have ever formed the core or the founding of a nation. Those are the principles on which we purport to stand. These principles are outrageously enlightened. They are a complete repudiation of any kind of aristocracy. They are a radical statement about the equality of all people, that all people are equal, that God gave all men inalienable rights of life and of liberty and of the pursuit of happiness. They also said, and this is equally radical, that governments are instituted to secure those rights. And number two, part of that, is that the people, should the government not be doing its job, that it is the right of the people to alter it or abolish it. Those are the principles on which we stand. Now that's where it all got started, but that's where it all got gnarly, obviously. Because out of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, 41 of them were themselves slave owners. So this dichotomy is who we have always been. This characterological bipolar nature that we are, on one hand, built on the most aspirational and enlightened principles that have ever formed the core of a nation, and that it is the job of every generation to, quote unquote, form a more perfect union. But at the same time, from the very beginning, in every generation, including our own, we have at times been the most violent perpetrators of transgression against our own principles. That's our story. That has been our story from the beginning. It is an ongoing saga, and each generation writes its chapter. You and I have a decision before us which chapter will be ours. Now, if you look at us through time, our narrative is such that we do tend towards justice. We do tend in the direction of self-correction. We responded to slavery with abolition. We responded to the institutionalized suppression of women with the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage, and two major waves of feminism. And we responded to institutionalized white supremacy and segregation with the civil rights movement. So in area after area, we have either made the correction, or you can see signs of our generation rising up even now and seeking to correct when and where we are off course. But in many ways, we are off course. Mass incarceration is an example of off course. Racial disparity in criminal sentencing is an example of off course. Mandatory minimums is an example of off course. The Keystone Pipeline is an example of off course. A ban on transgender and a denial of transgender or LGBTQ rights is off course. The separation of children from their parents at the border is an example of off course. 93 million Americans living near poverty in the richest country in the world is an example of off course. Millions of American children, 13 million hungry children, 100,000 homeless children is an example of off course. A national security agenda that is mainly dominated by short-term profits for defense contractors rather than any proactive agenda for peace is an example of off course. We have reverted in our time to what is essentially an aristocratic paradigm, because health insurance companies and big pharmaceutical companies and oil and gas companies and gun manufacturers and food companies and agricultural companies and oil and gas companies and chemical companies and defense contractors, they form a new corporate aristocracy. Now, this has been going on for 40 years, and it began with an economic theory called trickle-down economics. And trickle-down economics posited that all a corporation owes really is fiduciary or financial responsibility to its stockholders, even if that was at the expense of workers and community and environment. But the proposal that was embedded here was the idea that this would actually be good for everybody, because this small stockholder class would make all this money, but then they would create jobs. And so all this money would trickle down, and it would lift all boats. Well, I think after 40 years, we can say that the jury is in. It has certainly not lifted all boats. It has left millions of people without even a life vest. It has created wealth inequality greater than since 1929. We didn't have wealth inequality as an issue back even in the 1970s. It has left 1% of Americans owning more wealth than the bottom 90%. And that's why I say it is a paradigm. It is not just policy. It is an entire paradigm of thinking that we must overthrow. We must overthrow it in our minds. We must disenthrall ourselves of this idea that if you simply give enough money to really, really rich people, that somehow this will help everybody. That is what we have done. It has been a massive transfer of wealth that really amounts to a theft from the public treasury. Now, this is not about bad people. Not every rich person in America is a greedy bastard, any more than every poor person is noble and pure. This is not about individuals. This is not about demonizing individuals, because there's some very, very wealthy people, I think including even billionaires, who would agree with everything that we're talking about here today. It is about a system that has become corrupted. It is about a virulent strain of capitalism. That's what trickle-down economics is. It is a virulent strain of capitalism. Now, I want to say this. Some people believe that this kind of social and economic justice, this lack of social and economic justice, is inherent to capitalism. I actually am not one of those people. I do not believe that. To me, this is about capitalism that has been hijacked by a virulent strain of capitalism. I believe in capitalism with a conscience. I just believe that once we said that capitalism should have that the U.S. corporation should not be fettered by any ethical or moral responsibility, and it should be as deregulated as possible, we were on the path to ruin. So the issue now is, how do we course correct? Because once this economic system became so prevalent, within 10 to 20 years, there became this massive explosion of money on our political system. First, with the Supreme Court saying that money is free speech, and then more recently with the Citizens United decision, by which the Supreme Court gave unlimited power to corporations to influence our government. This has created what is, in essence, a system of legalized bribery. Now, that's a big deal. We're not functioning as a government of the people, by the people, for the people. That is not what's happening here. We are now functioning, as I said, as a corporate aristocracy. We are a government of, by, and for a few of the people. Of, by, and for huge multinational corporate interests. And our government, in policy after policy, tax policy, subsidy, deregulation, and so forth, does more to advocate for short-term profits for huge corporate interests than it does to advocate for us, the people of the United States, our children, other people in the world, or the planet on which we live. That means that we're throwing out our mission statement. That means a complete breach. That means a complete repudiation of what we said to repudiate aristocracy. Because that is the opposite of all men are created equal. It's the opposite of all men are given by God inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So we repudiated aristocracy in 1776, and I'm running for president with one basic message. It's time for us to repudiate it again. Now, if you look at our history, as I said before, we responded to slavery with abolition, and we responded to the institutionalized oppression of women with women's suffrage movement, and we responded to segregation with the civil rights movement. So even though you can certainly see problems in our history, it's important to identify with the problem solvers. Now, what happened with abolition, and what happened with women's suffrage, and what happened with the civil rights movement? Well, I'll tell you what didn't happen. They didn't wait for the government to fix it. They didn't look to the problem, to the government to solve the problem. The government created the problem. The government didn't wake up one day and say, let's end slavery. The government didn't wake up one day and say, let's give women the right to vote. The government didn't wake up one day and say, let's end segregation. Abolition was a people's movement. The people rose up and the people stepped in. And women's suffrage was a people's movement. The people rose up and the people stepped in. And same with civil rights. It wasn't that the government said, let's desegregate the American South. With Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, the people rose up and the people stepped in. We are now living at a time where there is a very prevalent naivete, a very prevalent belief that somehow the governmental status quo is going to change itself, when in fact, status quos do not change themselves, status quos perpetuate themselves. It is time once again for the people to step in. What we need to do, first of all, is to make sure that capitalist forces, and I said, I do not believe this is inherent to capitalism. It's a virulent strain of capitalism that have so corrupted our government. Remember, it is in the greatest tradition of American society that we push back against overreach by capitalist forces. That is why we have unions. That is why we have child labor laws. This is what we do in America. We used to have robber barons. We used to have terrible things like this, and that's what unions and things like that did. They pushed back. It is time for us to push back. That would take the form of, number one, we need to repeal the 2017 $2 trillion tax cut that gave 83 cents of every dollar to the very richest individuals and corporations. Put back in the middle class tax cut, because that, I think, should have been there to begin with. Second thing we need to do. Martin Luther King said, if they give it to rich people, they call it a subsidy. If they give it to poor people, they call it a handout. We need to stop these corporate subsidies. Last year, we gave $26 billion to oil and gas. Oil and gas is already making billions of dollars profits. We know what results in terms of the harm to the planet, but we gave them $26 billion. Corporate subsidies like that need to stop. Secondly of all, one of the greatest of the corporate aristocratic forces is Big Pharma. And the United States government has surrendered to Big Pharma the right to negotiate for lower drug prices, even at a time where people literally are dying because they cannot afford their insulin. And we need to recognize that, as I already said, our national security agenda is based not only on legitimate security expenditures, but hundreds of billions of dollars above that go to projects that really just have to do with short-term profit maximization for defense contractors. That needs to stop. In addition to that, I agree. Somebody who has $1 billion in assets in this country should be required to pay 3% tax. And if someone has over 50 million, it is reasonable that they would pay a 2% tax on those assets. Then we're going to have some cash on hand, ladies and gentlemen, and if you make me president, I'm telling you what we're going to do with that. We are going to have a season of repair, and it is a season of moral repair. Because when I talked before about all those ways in which America is off course, we have completely deviated from our moral compass. Now, my impression and my feeling and my experience of the American people is that we're good people. The problem is not that Americans aren't good people. We are a dignified people. We are a decent people. I'm not saying we're better than other people, because I don't think we're better than other people, but I think that we are decent, and I think the average American wants to live a decent, good life and is dictated by the heart and by conscience and integrity and trying to do the right thing. I don't think any of us make it 24/7 all the time, but I think that's where the vast majority of people live. That's not the problem. The problem is not with the individuals. I don't think the American lacks a moral compass. The problem is that our public policy lacks a moral compass. Our public policy is not driven by ethics. Our public policy is not driven by any sense of conscience. Our public policy can't be driven by any of those ethical or moral considerations when it's driven by the financial and economic dictates of the corporate aristocracy, which posits that short-term profits are more important than any other ethical consideration. We need to close that gap. Other generations said no to slavery. Other generations said no to the suppression of women. Other generations said no to segregation. It is our turn. First thing we need to do is recognize the horrible human toll that is being paid, the unnecessary human suffering that occurs for no other reason than that this economic injustice so entrenched in our society underpins so much of the human experience in this country. That virulent strain of capitalism that I mentioned has no use for anyone that does not serve it. So the two populations which are given the shortest shrift by that form of that strain are children and old people. Starting with children. I think I already mentioned we have 13 million hungry children in the United States. We have 100,000 homeless children in the United States. You make me president of the United States, we are going to have a massive realignment of investment in the direction of America's children. We have millions of American children who go to school every single day in schools where they don't even have the adequate school supplies with which to teach a child to read. And if a child cannot learn to read by the age of 8, then the chances of high school graduation are drastically decreased, and the chances of incarceration are drastically increased. We have millions of American children that psychologists say are experiencing a form of PTSD that is no less severe than the PTSD that is experienced by a returning veteran from Afghanistan or Iraq. And remember, if you're a veteran, it's post-traumatic. For these kids, it's present traumatic because it's trauma that is triggered and re-triggered every single day. The despair of these children has simply been normalized by our political establishment. And for the most cynical of reasons. They're not old enough to vote. So they're not a constituency. And they're not old enough to work, so they don't have any financial leverage, so they don't have any highly paid lobbyists. They do have some citizen lobbyists, but nothing that compares with the clout of all the corporate lobbyists whose power and money dominates Washington. I want a Department of Children and Youth because these vulnerabilities and these challenges completely overwhelm the capacity of the Department of Education and the Department of Health and Human Services. We need trauma-informed education. We need anti-bullying. We need violence prevention. We need community health services, not only for the children, but also for their families. We need community wraparound services. We need mindfulness in the schools. We need nutrition. Ladies and gentlemen, and everyone else, we have children who are traumatized before preschool. I visited an public elementary school here in Las Vegas, where the principal told me that she has elementary school children on suicide watch. And she told me that when she called the district to say that she needed a social worker or a counselor, she was told that they couldn't send her one because her school is not among the worst. This is all over the United States. And also, we must stop, and I think this is central to this, we must stop the absolutely immoral way that we base our educational funding primarily on property taxes. That means a child who lives in a well-to-do neighborhood stands a very good chance of a high-quality public school education. But if a child doesn't have that good fortune in an economic sense, the chances of going to school in one of those classrooms where they may or may not have glue sticks and paper is almost guaranteed. That needs to stop. Every school in America, and if you make me president, that will be a national goal, for every school in America to be a palace of learning and culture and the arts. Now, by the way, to those who say we can't afford it, think of the millions and billions and possibly trillions of dollars in unrealized potential that this country is allowing to slip through our fingers simply because we refuse to educate every American child. If you want to see the genius of this country, if you want to see the entrepreneurial potential of this country, I'll tell you where it is. It's in the brain of every 5-year-old in every neighborhood. If this country really wants economic prosperity in 10 years, I'll tell you what you do. You treat your 10-year-olds better today. There is no power in the sky, there's no power in the wind, there's no power in the sun, there's no power beneath the ground. No power source that can begin to equal the power inside the human brain. And it's all in early childhood. If we really want peace and prosperity in our future, the way we do it is front-end our resources towards American children. Second thing we need to face as adults, and I say as adults because the political establishment does not treat us as adults. It's a politics of people pleasing. I figure out what I think you want to hear, I figure out what you want to hear, I figure out what you want to hear, I figure out what you want to hear. You black, you white, you gay, you straight, you male, you female, what do you want to hear? My operatives have told me what you want to hear. I'm not playing that game with you. I think that keeps us infantilized. I think what the American political establishment does not realize is how smart we are. We're not stupid. We don't need people to talk to us like we're kids. We don't need people to talk to us as though things aren't happening that we know are happening. We'd all be better off if we just talk about what's happening and then we can deal with it. So I'm telling you that we need to act, and we need to act radically to reverse, not just stop climate change, but to reverse climate change over the next 7 years. And we need to do that. We need to shift from a dirty economy to a clean economy, or we could be facing within 15 to 20 years massive social collapse, the kind of which we have never even seen in the modern era. You guys are in Las Vegas. I don't need to tell you. You know the conversation about heat rising, and you know, you've read enough articles, I'm sure this is your town. We could be facing within 20 years, if we're not careful, whole swaths of countries, possibly swaths of continents, where the heat is so great that the land is literally uninhabitable. If the land is uninhabitable because of the heat, by definition, food cannot be grown there. Food cannot be grown there. So what are we talking about? We're talking about massive food shortages. We're talking about economic collapse. We're talking about social collapse. And we're talking about what could be hundreds of millions of environmental refugees. We have 63 million refugees on the planet, displaced persons on the planet today, which is greater than what we've had since World War II. Imagine hundreds of millions. You think people are building walls now? You think boats are capsizing now? Try hundreds of millions. We must act. We must sequester the carbon. We must reforest. We must continue and grow the investments in green energy, and we must deal with the animal factory farming. Because if we don't deal with that, then even if we did everything else, the nitrous oxide and the methane would do us in. We need we need to go, just like we need to go beyond the Paris Accords now, we need to go beyond even the Green New Deal. And we need to be able to enroll some of the industries that have actually done industrial scale harm to the earth in the effort for industrial scale repair. Next thing I want to talk to you about is race in the United States. I don't think that the average American is racist. That's not my belief. That's not my experience. But it is my belief and my experience that the average American is vastly undereducated about race. Maybe they learned it in the 7th grade. They don't really remember what they learned. They probably didn't learn the whole story. And my feeling, and because I believe the American people are decent people, and my experience is that when you lay out the facts, a case for reparations does not in any way sound outrageous. So I'd like to go over some of the facts with which some of you might not be completely familiar with. The first slave ships were brought over here in 1619, and slavery was not abolished, obviously, until 1865. So that is just shy of 250 years. At the end of the Civil War, historians believe there were between 4 and 5 million formerly enslaved people. They were promised by the Union General Tecumseh Sherman, we've all heard the expression, for every former slave family of 4, they were to be given 40 acres and a mule, which, if you think about it, would have meant everything to somebody who's told you're not a slave anymore, but where are you supposed to go and what are you supposed to do? In most of those cases, the promise was rescinded because what happened is that the federal troops were sent down to the South. This period was called Reconstruction. The federal troops were sent to the South, stationed there to guarantee that slavery would not be reconstituted. And interestingly enough, during that period of time, it's pretty fascinating what happened. There were black congressmen, there were black senators. You really got a sense of what might have been, and what I think definitely would have been had Abraham Lincoln lived. As it was, however, in 1877, the federal troops were withdrawn, and the white Southern legislatures took their revenge. They passed throughout the South what were called black code laws to ensure subpar political and economic and social opportunities. And what then began was another almost century of institutionalized violence against black people. What do you call lynchings? What do you call Ku Klux Klan, if not domestic terrorism? So you had 250 years of slavery, and then you had another 100 years, except minus that 12 years, of another period of institutionalized violence. That's 350 years. I mean, I think that for us to move through these times, for us to really live where we need to in the 21st century in order to transform this country, we have to come at these things as more than just facts on a piece of paper that we just take in above the neck. We have to have a whole person grasp of history now. We have to have a whole person grasp of what's happening on this planet to really allow yourself to even begin to take in all the suffering that we're talking about here, and the generation upon generation upon generation upon generation of trauma. I'm sure we all realize and would agree, if you've been kicking someone to the ground, and certainly what we've just described for 350 years is kicking someone to the ground, you owe them two things. Number one, stop kicking. And number two, here, let me help you get back up. It was 100 years after the end of the Civil War when the US Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, the famous picture of Lyndon Johnson and Martin Luther King. The Civil Rights Act dismantled segregation. And then the next year, in 1965, they passed the Voting Rights Act, which would ensure equal access to the polls. Now notice, this access to the polls thing is a historic thread we've got. This is what women needed. Women were institutionalized, there was institutionalized oppression. The women suffragettes said, if we can vote, we could have power, we could change things. What the whole idea of the Voting Rights Act, so that black people could get to the polls, everybody could have access to the polls, was if we can have access to the polls, we can change things. Every American should be very aware that in 2013, our Supreme Court, led by John Roberts, began chipping away at the Voting Rights Act, which is why we have all these voter suppression efforts all over the country today. So, with the Voting Rights Act, we did that. However, the economic gap that existed between blacks and whites at the end of the Civil War is a gap that has never been closed. And even in cases where there has been an accumulation of black wealth, there have been many examples of state and local laws which set out to thwart those efforts. Germany has paid $89 billion to Jewish organizations since World War II. And that doesn't mean that the Holocaust didn't happen. But it has gone far to establish reconciliation between Germany and the Jews of Europe. My plan is for reparations to the tune of $500 billion that would be dispersed over a period of 20 years. The money would be dispersed to a reparations council made up of black leaders from culture, from business, from politics, from academia, and so forth. The stipulation on the part of the US government would be that the money is to be used for purposes of economic and educational renewal. Within that stipulation, it would be the job of black America to determine, not white America to determine. So I want you to see the difference between race-based policies and reparations. Race-based policies, look, it's good. If somebody's going to give billions of dollars to historically black colleges, certainly that's good. If somebody's going to give billions of dollars to help with black home ownership, that's good. There's nothing bad about it. But my campaign is not just about treating symptoms. My campaign is also about addressing cause. My campaign is not just about telling the truth. It's about telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. If all you have is race-based policies, first of all, there's something in my mind rather paternalistic about my saying, I mess with you, and I'm going to tell you how I'm going to fix you. There's something that, and it doesn't address what is this problem here to begin with. That makes a financial restitution, but it doesn't go all the way. Reparations is something else. Reparations has a moral force. Reparations addresses the spiritual wound. It is emotional, psychological, as well as economic, because reparations contain an inherent mea culpa. It is an inherent acknowledgement of a wrong that has been done. An inherent acknowledgement of a wrong that has been done, the acknowledgement of a debt that is owed, and the acknowledgement of the willingness on the parts of people to pay it. Before we leave that subject, I do want to point out that reparations for slavery would be an economic stimulus. It has been established that if black families were to make as much money as white families, we would have a $1.5 trillion larger economy. So remember what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about $500 billion. Look at the $2 trillion tax cut, 83 cents to the largest corporation, because that's supposed to be an economic stimulus, which everybody knows it's not. Nobody's ever produced any evidence that it will even pay for itself. I want to end an aberrational chapter in American history. We need to just end a chapter, and we need to start another one. We need to take a very, very big ship and turn it around. It's not going to happen immediately, but I believe that paying reparations for slavery is a big part of it, whether you're a person or you're or a country. You can't have the future you want if you're not willing to clean up the past. This was our original character defect, and we need reparative measures to be taken towards Native Americans as well. It's this deep toxicity that just is in this baton that we pass along generation to generation to generation. Several popes ago, John Paul was his name, and he used an incredible expression called the purification of memory. And he went around in the years right before his death, and he started apologizing to a lot of people and groups and countries for the sins of the Catholic Church. This was before all the stuff with the recent, the sexual issues with priests, et cetera. This was before that. And I was reading his words, and he said, if you do not apologize for a past wrong, then you remain unconscious of the ways that you repeat it. And I believe that when you look at something like mass incarceration and racial disparity in criminal sentencing and mandatory minimums, these are all examples of unconscious and in some cases conscious ways that we carry on a very, very really evil aspect of our national functioning. And the last thing I want to talk to you about is our national security. I mentioned already that it is based more on short-term profits for defense contractors. When Dwight Eisenhower gave his farewell address, now for those of you who might be too young certainly to remember, but you might not have studied this in school, so Dwight Eisenhower was the supreme Allied commander during World War II. Now during World War II, before the war, we did not have a standing army. So they had to rush and get one together after Pearl Harbor. Now, nobody is saying we don't need a standing army. I think we all know we need that. But Dwight Eisenhower came back. The war was over in 1945. And then in 1952, he became a Republican president of the United States. He served 2 terms. He was president from 1952 to 1960, at which point JFK became a Democratic president. In his farewell address to the nation, Dwight Eisenhower, certainly no enemy of the military, and certainly no one naive about the needs that the United States has for military service, warned us about what he phrased the military-industrial complex. And he talked about the fact that basically when this much money can be made, you better watch out. And he talked about the influence of the military-industrial complex and the fact that this not only existed, but would persist. And Eisenhower wrote really profound, there are profound quotes from him, a speech he gave called The Cross of Iron, where he talked about how every warship launched, every rocket fired is, in the final analysis, a theft from those who are hungry and are not fed, and a theft from those who are cold and are not clothed. One of the things that I find fascinating about him, and also about Roosevelt, remember Franklin Roosevelt, the president during World War II, and Eisenhower, these men led us through World War II. They were no slouches when it came to military valor or military success. But if you go to the Franklin Roosevelt Memorial in Washington, D.C., there's an extraordinary quote, a paragraph from him, "I hate war." So I have great respect for military leaders. These horrors that we're discussing are not the fault of military decisions. These are political decisions. I think the military needs to receive every dollar that they feel they legitimately need to keep us safe. But if you look at the 800 bases, if you look at the 70 countries where we're present, if you look at things such as the B-21 Raiders, $560 million each for a plane that drops nuclear bombs as well as conventional bombs. Why do we need 100 airplanes that carry nukes? You see clearly that this has more to do with money for the defense contractors than it has to do with our national security. I particularly, as a presidential candidate, find it unbelievable that we're not even discussing this. There are only 2 candidates who even talk about it. We become like Stepford citizens. We just discuss the issues that we're told that we should discuss. We have a young generation. You don't even remember a time when the United States was not at war. That's how normalized it has become. We need to stop this. This is why I want the United States Department of Peace. I want the peace-building agencies to be as robustly funded and supported as is the military. You don't just take medicine, you have to cultivate health. And you don't just prepare for any war that might be necessary, you also cultivate peace. Sickness is the absence of health, war is the absence of peace. I want a peace academy as well as a military academy, so that there are those who study the expertise and the skill sets of peace building as well as military. Now, some of you might say, I don't know what you say, but I can tell you that everything I've just said is common sense. Did anything I say, I don't know, feed the kids, repair the earth, try to make peace, do right by people that you wronged? Why should any of this be considered anything other than common sense? The fact that it sounds almost radical shows you how off course we are. Everything I just said is, I don't know, if you take this idea that we should love each other and you put it in political policy, that should be considered radical. That should tell you how off course we are. And that's why I'm running for president. I believe we need a fundamental pattern disruption of the economic and social and political dynamics which prevail in our country. Of course, the system would have you believe that no one outside that system is possibly qualified, because they're right. I'm not schooled in that system, right? But I challenge the idea that only those who are part of, whose careers have been entrenched in the mindset that drove us into this ditch are the only people qualified to lead us out of the ditch. I don't believe that the current president, that the problem is that he lacked experience. I think it's that he lacks ethics. He lacks a visceral taste for democracy, I think. Very experienced politicians took us into Vietnam. Very experienced politicians took us into Iraq. We need right now not so much political mechanics. We have great political mechanics. Certainly the Democratic Party has many great political mechanics, and the Republican Party has some good political mechanics too, if the president chosen to bring them in. But right now, we need a political visionary more than we need a political mechanic at the helm. The problem is not just that you'd ask your car mechanic what to do, because the car mechanic doesn't necessarily know what road you should take. And we need moral certitude. You can have your political mechanics as your vice president, your political mechanic as your cabinet secretaries throughout your government and the functioning of the government. But as Franklin Roosevelt said, the president himself or herself, the primary job is moral leadership, and that the administrative job aspect of the job is secondary. That is what, not only what I offer is in terms of my vision and my agenda, but it's also what I believe my skill set and my qualifications have prepared me for. I believe that many of my qualifications are different than the qualifications of some traditional candidates, but I do not believe that my qualifications are any less significant or relevant to the times in which we live, and it's up to you to decide whether or not they might even be more relevant. So like I said, nobody's lying to you. I have great respect for all the candidates. They're all telling you the truth, but I think we need some more radical truth-telling than that. We need to do what you do in a court of law. You need to tell the truth and the whole truth and nothing but the truth, and I think you can take it, and I think we can be adults, and I think we can handle this crisis that we're in, and on the other side of that, there will be a chapter in American history, probably the most brilliant we've ever had, and even more importantly, about which we can all feel proud. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.